Rosa? Rosa, where are you? You're supposed to be up here doing your sewing, staying out of mischief. That rascal. I'll bet she's out in the field with her father and her brothers. She should have been born a boy. For the way she can scamper off this porch and head out yonder. She didn't want to stay and weed. It's amazing how this time of year the weeds can come up in the garden quicker than anything. And not only that, that kitchen garden is the size of some of our fields that we had back in Pennsylvania. But, goodness, you all came up here. And you must be traveling westward this time of day. Pulling in. You menfolk can put yours, as soon as Michael comes, you menfolk can put your horses, wagon teams down in the barn. You can't miss it. It's that mound of tree limbs and sod down there. Someday it'll be a barn. Truth is, that's all we ever say around here in the Flint Hills. Someday, here in the Kansas Territory, someday. That's all Kansas Territory is about. But my goodness, look at you. Look at you. So this is what women are wearing back east now? Oh my goodness. May I? Oh. Styles have surely changed since I was back there, and I didn't think it'd been that many winters since I had been there. Yeah, it just goes to show. Maybe I better explain why I'm even out here. My husband, Michael, we're yoke mates. You understand? We're yoked to this wagon life, and sometimes they have more trouble in the wagon, and sometimes it has less. But in this case, when we were back in Pennsylvania, he came home one day from having the horses shod and started talking about going on out just west of Pennsylvania. He said they were talking about the land didn't have very many rocks in it. Few trees. I said, so how can that be good land? If it can't even grow trees, it can't be good land. And then he showed me this little beat-up copy of the New England Immigrant Aid book, talking about what was possible out here in the territory. And then the next thing, he just kept talking, and then he got this goofy grin on his face, just like his boys, or like when I first laid eyes upon that young man, not the old married farmer, steady, hard-working, older, bent over. No, he had that boyish grin on his face. And as it was all over, he started talking about, there's a letter that one of the men brought from all the way from Indiana. It's just the gold that they're reading about in the far western Kansas Territory. But one of the men, his brother, is out in Indiana, and he said, come and live with us out here. Get your own place. Why, don't you understand? We're lonely. So bring everybody you can out here, because the ground is good, and he wanted people to come out here and settle out here so that he wouldn't be quite so lonely. Well, I still said no. I said, here was where I was born. Here is where my family has land. Here is where some of the earlier of our children are buried, let alone, and he stopped me right there. And he said, yes, but if we go to Indiana, we can have a good quality land out there. I came back to trees and stone, and I knew I was losing the argument at a certain point when his eyes crossed and he stood like this. You know how you get to know a man after a while, you don't have to say much to him. Ah, yes. And then we turned around and we started preparing. Seemed like a lot more work to give up the land we had and pack up and go west than I thought it would be. But the land of ours sold quickly, and I knew then we could use that money to buy land further out to the west. We kept out a good sturdy team of draft animals, horses, 2 oxen, repaired the wagons. The oxen pulled all the good heavy farm tools, and we loaded the rest up into with the horses. My son John, who was a big boy by that point, all of 15 years of age and knowing every bit, he was as big as a man. And 2 years younger than that, he knew he was even bigger than his older brother. It's amazing how children grow up, isn't it? Well, we headed out. I asked my mother to take care of the ones in the cemetery. I knew I'd never be coming back, and it was hard for me to leave them. But I couldn't cry. You see, if you're the mother, you've got to be big enough, strong enough that your children don't get sad. So we left. Goodness, as you well know, you can be a terrible, loud, rowdy group. Oh, go ahead and ignore them. It's their day off from working. So I guess Michael's back from the field down there, and they think they're going to get a little bit of ration, as if there ever is any extra food around here. As we got down and started to travel, making decisions every step of the way, when I said goodbye to my mother, I think it was the hardest thing. I thought it was going to be leaving the land, but it was my mother that got to me. Knowing I'd never see her alive again, older. But I faced to the west, and I followed my man Michael west. And as we traveled more and more, you know how it is. You got little ones trying to keep them quiet in the wagon, and they're cranky and they think that they can walk along with the wagon. And your wagon's already loaded down with the chickens you had to bring along so you could feed yourself, my 2 prize geese, and that wonderful tabby cat that the children could not leave at home. And she yowled worse than anything, and I thought her kittens were bad. And then, of course, there was the pup. That pup grew and got older, but at the time, he rode in the wagon more because of his short little legs. But we had to take home with us because we weren't sure when we'd be back. Well, we made it off toward Indiana, and we were traveling along, but there was nobody else with us. And we weren't sure of the road, but at least you could see the path. Unlike out here in Kansas territory where you can't see through the grass. You know, here in the hills here, the grass folds over the wagon wheels and then opens up, as if no human has ever passed before. Well, in Indiana, let's just say it's well-traveled roads. We were soon joined by others going west. And along the way, it was just so nice when we found other wagons going west. One of the women in the wagon had a little girl just the age of my Rosa. And goodness knows, if you think one is trouble, try traveling with 2. We traded the children back and forth to make it easier on us. We came to a high draw that just got worse and worse because it had rained and rained and the water was coming up. We knew that if we didn't get to the other side, we would be on this side. And I don't know how soon the water would go down so we could cross. My husband and the other men were out there talking about it, and they said, "Can you see the oak leaves? They're the size of a mouse's ear. We'll never make it to Indiana in time to plant crop. We're going to cross." Well, we women tried to convince them to be rational, be calm, not to cross. But we're going to get the crops in. So they took tree limbs and lashed them on the other side of the wagon, double hitched the teams to give more pulling power, draft power, and as they came across, Anne and her mother's wagon, the first one across, made it just fine. They brought that team back and hooked onto her wagon. She didn't swim. I can't say anything. I didn't swim. Crossing any stream for any woman is scary. The men never admitted that the water is going so fast that it is frightening. As we got further out into the waterway, that boat with the lashed logs to stabilize it all of a sudden started going downstream. It caught in the current. The horses were struggling for all they were worth. One of the horses stumbled and went down, caught in the water, caught in the harness. He couldn't get out. The other horses were pulling as all they could. This horse was scrambling. It kicked the other wreck. And all I could do was hold her daughter with my daughter next to me as we watched. Anne had told her children, "You hold on to the wagon seat. I don't care what happens, you hold on to that wagon seat." And she held her baby in one arm, and she held on for all she was worth. But the way those logs were pulling down the wagon stream, and it caught, started to tip over, and jumped. She was such a proper woman. She always wore 7 pounds of petticoats, even though it was out here in the... She tried to swim. I saw her trying to swim. She had her baby in one hand. She couldn't swim because her petticoats were dragging her down. So she put her baby up into a tree branch or tried to and cling, and another current caught her and she twisted and turned under. And in the action, her baby fell too. I looked back to the wagon and the children were trapped underneath. There was only one loud scream, and that was from Anne's husband, who out there with his knife trying to cut through the tent that was falling over on the children, holding him in under the water. Michael, who was not a good swimmer but brave, took his knife, jumped out, and was hacking at the leather, the lugs that pull the wagon forward. He was cutting them, trying to get the horses loose. He freed one, freed two. The other one was caught and drowning with his feet caught in the harness of the other. He dived under and cut him again. Boxes started to float downstream, and so I grabbed my little girl and her girl and pulled them into my lap and held them. I couldn't tell them everything would be all right. I could just hold them. The boxes floated downstream. The babies floated upside down. Michael emerged out of the water. I was so glad to see him. But Anne's husband did not. We looked for the bodies. Never did find all of them. Never found Anne. We buried the rest in a common grave on the riverbank because we couldn't go on until we knew. Finally, when the water went down, our wagon crossed. Her parents, broken-hearted, elderly, decided they were going to turn around and go back. Michael helped them get across that same deadly stream. I waited, and we went on west, our two teams. We were alone out there. My children remembered what happened to Ann's children, and when we said to do something, they never forgot it. They hung on or did what we asked them to. But I still felt sorry because we were the only ones. When we made it to Indiana, it was a territory then. We found our friends and we settled there. I hated the place. No trees, no rock, no stone. I asked my husband what he had promised me, and he looked down at his feet real routinely every time I asked him. We stayed for a crop year, and then we sold the land replenishment. It was a homestead relinquishment that we'd acquired, so we sold it for a bit, and we headed on west. We crossed into Kansas territory. We came in down by Westport. We headed on west down the Lawrence Road. That's what they called it. It left from Westport and went on to Lawrence. But the pro-slaveryites and the anti-slaveryites were still about them, all around. I didn't like it. I said it was unsafe for the children and me, and Michael said it was unsafe for him too. You see, he had a Pennsylvanian accent. That must have meant he was, well, I never asked him really, and he didn't want to have to say his political viewpoint. We kept on going. We took on the military road. That's what they called it, coming from Fort Leavenworth down to Fort Scott. Not a good place to travel. If you think pro-slaveryites and anti-slaveryites were a problem down by Lawrence, it was even worse on that road. So we headed on west. We'd heard about a place called Council Grove. It was supposed to be a little bit larger. Out in the west. They said there were no politics there. It was hard for me to believe, but we headed on down. Now, we lost the road, and I can't blame Michael. I can't blame John or Daniel, any of the men in my group, as the boys had taken to calling themselves. Since they were taller than me now, what are you going to argue with them? So as we headed on across, that grass just kept opening up and closing. And as I was working with the oxen, and I had Rosa, I kept looking at the grass and going, if we follow this ridge line, and if we follow the other ridge line, if we follow the other ridge line, because if we get down in these draws, there is no way we're ever going to be able to get our wagons out. So we came across, and finally there was a point where we didn't think that we could get down safely. Our horses were exhausted, our oxen were dragging their feet, our milk cow we could barely move, and my children, cranky. Me, cranky. And when we got there, my husband Michael said, well, what do you think we ought to do? I said, well, let's climb that hill and look out over the land and see what we can see. There's got to be a better answer here than standing at the bottom of the hill looking at ravines ahead of us. Let's go up there. We got up there. Beautiful, beautiful hills. As I climbed to the top, I noticed all the limestone that was there, like Pennsylvania. And when we got on top of the hill, and I looked out, a creek, it had to be a creek with all those trees. Trees, limestone, stone, trees. I kept pointing out to Michael, stone, trees, in case he couldn't see it. You know, there is a point when you're tired, look. And he looked at me, crossed my arms, patted my stomach. He said, I think we need to find a home soon. And he knew what I meant. And then I told him that I would not be cooking for him much more if we didn't find a home soon. That did it. It wasn't my condition, it was the cooking. As we eased down off the ridge lines, carefully maneuvering through a couple of the draws. That creek, John rode down with the extra horse we had to scout it out. He found the crossing. You know, that same crossing you used to come in from the east out here to the western side of the creek? We did improvements on it. It wasn't near that good when we started working with it, but we could ease our wagons across. And the horses by now, like the oxen, knew to hunker down, hit it, and pull up the other side. We made it across. Big, beautiful oak trees. And a walnut tree. I thought that maybe would be where we stayed. But then I looked at the water lines and thinking floods, and thinking this was not what I wanted for my family. So on the flat part up here, we rode along it, and we were just going to camp that night. One night was all we were going to camp. But when I looked at the flood line and knew we were above the flood line, I started liking the land a little bit better. And as we moved down toward from the crossing further down, I really liked the grass. It was as tall as the wagon. That had to be good for the horses. And then as I looked further on down, I pointed out to John, who was riding the horse that day, to ride down where there are good trees down there. I mean, you know, big enough for a log cabin. And he turned around and came back. I don't know how he got that old horse, that tired, old, foot-dragging horse, to come back that quick. And he said, oh, yes, there's oak and walnut trees down there. And further on down, there are these little trees just the right size for making fence line. Then I asked him, is there good water? And he said he thought he saw a spring. Now, I knew we could drink creek water. I knew there was nobody else out here. It was totally empty where we were, I thought. And then, well, we needed a place to camp, and we were tired. We thought we'd stay a couple days. Took a shovel down out of the wagon, took a good spade of dirt, quality soil. Now, Michael was excited about where my heart place was starting to be. And I looked around, and there was a spring close enough for me to carry water, and that made the difference for him. And we just decided that that was where we were going to be. Funny now when I look back at it, and I'm bragging about my land to you, and you haven't even found yours yet. And I know you're going to have to go further on west to find your good quality land. It being on toward evening time, perhaps I can sell you supper. For 2 bits, 1/4, I can sell you 2 eggs, cornbread, and deer gravy. And you ladies will not have to cook. Ah, yes, that brought a smile. While you menfolk are talking, you can talk to me, and I'll provide you with a meal. My cabin is not much to look at. No cabin out here is, really. The first winter we came here, let's just say we called it a cabin, but it was more tree limbs and brushes and grass on it than actually a quality one. And just when we started to build it with log is another story. We were doing well. We cut the trees the year before and was ready to build it up. Everything was going great. I got the garden in on time. Do you understand how important that is to a woman to have her garden in? And not only did I get that garden planted to feed my family, but I planted some of the marigold seed that I'd brought all the way from home from Pennsylvania. And that poor, tired, old, scraggly yellow rose bush. You know, you ladies have connections to home that you just can't give up. And it started to grow. I couldn't believe it. I figured it would have died over all the travels and all. I was working in the garden one day, and all of a sudden, Rosa had a kind of a yelp and came running toward me. Now, she knew about snakes, so I didn't think it would be that, but I couldn't figure out why her eyes were this big as she ran to me, and she didn't say anything. Usually, that child could talk. And she just ran right straight to me and ran around behind my skirt and pulled it around her. And she just kind of, and she was a big girl, so I figured, what scared her so bad that she had to go back to the, and then I looked up. 3 warriors on horseback. One on the most beautiful spotted horse I had ever seen, with his hair braided down on sideways. Just a magnificent young man. And he was riding straight toward me. I looked to see where Michael and the boys were, and as usual, they were not here. And so Rosa clung to me, and I waited, and then he rode up and he went, said something I never understood, but I understood what this meant. Well, I thought the only thing that would be safe to do was take him in and feed him. That's what most men wanted, was food when they go like. So I went in, and I'll tell you, those 3 warriors ate every single bit of flour, every biscuit, every piece of cornmeal that I could find, and left us totally without. But they were satisfied. And when they got up, I not understanding their language, theirs not understanding me, they walked out, and one of them looked at me and said something, and he reached right above the door. One hand he took the rifle, the other hand he took the shot and pouch, and got on his horse and rode away. Now, this was our only rifle, our only shot, our only powder. It was going to be a very long winter of hunger, I thought. Michael came in out of the field, and I was glad he hadn't come in earlier, because it might have created problems that I had solved. Michael came in, and I had to tell him what happened to the rifle. Now, this was a good thing also, because Michael could not hit a barn door if the barn door stood still, and it was a double one big enough for a team to go through. I had been doing the hunting for us until John got old enough, and then I fed John. But, goodness. Nobody said anything that night around the table. Nobody ate much either. Some chicken eggs. That's all I had to feed my children. They left the chickens because they didn't know what to do with them. And I was glad about that, because that meant more food. That night, as we were getting ready to go to bed, quiet but hungry, whoa! Echoed across the valley, right down the creek. I thought, well, at least the rifle works. And Michael just looked grimly at the door. Then we heard horses riding out front. It was on toward the middle of the night, and horses running out front, that's usually not a good sign. I heard a thunk, and then I heard other sounds. And a young man, a voice out there, said something I could not understand the language, and I could smell blood, but I knew where my family was. Next morning, a deer haunch was hanging out there, beautifully dressed. And Michael said, well, I may not be using the rifle, but somebody is. And we had fresh deer meat. And as soon as that haunch got gone, that warrior brought another one. And another one. He was an excellent hunter. I tried to get John to learn to go with him, but John thought he needed to work the field for some strange reason. He wanted to work real hard at home. I didn't mind those warriors coming around. They were no problem to me. They respected that I fed them, and they came to love the corn, beans, and squash out of the field. They never touched my kitchen garden, but they brought me deer. They called the rifle powerful. I wasn't sure what the powerful meant, and then they showed me, because in the stock there was a compass, and in that compass they called it something I later found out sounded like medicine, power, and they'd watch that needle move around with the directions and all the brass on it and all. They kept that rifle so polished. It looked better than when Michael had it. They left it for a while and then they were gone. They just, all the pony drags, the women, the children, all the warriors were gone off to the west. Something I found out that meant buffalo, because they showed me a bit of the hide. And when they came back, because the last thing they did before they left was slip back into the house, grab the rifle, powder horn, and shot. And when they came back, I had a beautiful buffalo robe, and oh, I had dried buffalo meat to feed my family for the winter. And the rifle came back until they needed it again. I would call them good neighbors. Every fall, we saw the people coming across. And we saw them up there with their pony drags. And as they drove along, for I have no other way to explain what was happening when they drove the team of horses. The young men in front crossing back and forth scouting, full feathers coming in, the pony drag behind them, and women. Women. Well, I couldn't talk to them, but you see, we could talk. And when they found out my children and their children, one woman, who I later understood was called Grower, because she grew things. She came up one time, and she came up, and I did not have to understand her language, but she came up to me and went, and turned around and showed me her baby. She gave me the most buffalo horn spoon I have ever seen. And I gave her a silver spoon that I had brought all the way from Pennsylvania. She was my friend. Do you understand? We couldn't talk, but we could talk. And every year she brought back her children for me to see how much they'd grown. And she showed me her silver spoon, and I showed her the buffalo horn spoon, and we hugged a woman, another woman, until you all came. It's very lonely out here. I'm giving you ladies this fair warning: the further west you go, it's not just the lack of milk and eggs and trees, but it's the loneliness that will come to you. I want you to be prepared. The men folk will find plenty to do, and you women folk will work too hard. The last winter that they came along, How do I explain the cold, snow, and winds and how they blow out here in the territory? The first year we were here, we forgot, we didn't know. It's amazing what we didn't know surviving. We had built kind of something that we would call a privy, necessary room, gaps, the snow came right on through. But we did have a latch string on the door, so we felt safe. The wind was blowing across and the snow was drifting up. And I didn't realize that with the latch string in and the snow coming across, we couldn't get out. It got higher and higher and higher. And my youngest son, George, totally forgot to pull the latch string out the last time he had been. So we started putting our wood pile along to the north, and I hope you do the same. It's not much of a pile now, but that's the remnants from last year, so do plan on putting it so the snow catches it. George often had trouble remembering to not leave the latch string out. He said, well, we have no one around us. It didn't do any good to remind him of it. So in our cabin, we had a big fireplace at one side, and the children slept up on pallets of quilt and branches and everything up there. And as we were up there that one night, I wondered why I could sleep so long. Michael, perhaps you have a man like this, who snores like a bear, and nothing wakes him up. I don't care what is going on with the children, what is going on outside. He is asleep now, thank you. And he was gone. Usually, when I get cold, I get up and build up the fire, but I was not getting cold. And oh my goodness, his sawing logs over here, and the baby was between us, and it was so warm, and I was so comfortable, and all of a sudden I realized it's been a long time since I built up the fire. And I heard stirring up above in the loft. It was not a mouse. And I looked up, and through the cut door that we used for the children to get up and down in, I saw the children leaning out, looking at something on the floor, and their eyes were big. I thought, I probably ought to get up out of bed and see. Unwillingly. You muster up your courage, because you know it's going to be freezing cold to put your feet on the floor. Why did you put limestone down? Well, you know, it was there and it was somewhat flat. So I braved myself, swung my feet out, and jumped up. Hoo-ah! And I almost did the same thing because I stepped on some man's stomach. I stood straight up, woke up the whole household. Goosematter looked up at me, muttering something in his own language, and then he looked at me and he said, cold. We, cold. Always. That's true. We always had them come in the winter. Usually we were awake when they came in. They were very quiet. There were Indians on every chair, every table, under the table, and under my feet. But not that time. I was standing up in bed. The baby was screaming. The children were being very quiet up there. And, well, I never built up the fire that night. Whoever was closest to it built it up. And the next morning, Grower and her children and I combined our food, and we ate together. They stayed with us in the cabin. They went out to take care of their horses when we went out to do chores. I missed them. The government said they had to go. Grower came by to tell me goodbye. That was worse than leaving my mother, I think. and it left me the only woman in the area. And I watched as they rode away. We went down to camp afterwards. My children found a few beads. That's all I have left. The government said the Potawatomi would be coming in. They were different than the Kanza. They were not quite as comfortable neighbors. They said they had the right to be here. Government moved them here. I couldn't argue with that. But that same winter was a bad one. We didn't have much food. But you don't turn a hungry person away. That was also when the surveyors came through on the land. I could not believe what they told me. We thought we were out here homesteading on unclaimed land. We had marked it off by meets and bounds. We'd used the creek line. We'd used the compass. The surveyor said, yes, the house was on one parcel of surveyed land and the barn was in the other. Our fields were there, just right across. They showed me. I couldn't argue. Michael couldn't argue with what the surveyor said. So we asked what they should do because we didn't want to give up what we had with good fields, fencing. We had put in seasons of hard labor. And well, you know how it is. Your yoke mates, sometimes there's another problem goes into the wagon that's already pretty heavy. As we came across, we made the decision. Yes, we'd have to do something about this. So he hitched up the team of oxen. We put in some wood because that's all we had to sell. And he headed to a Compton, which is where the land office was. When he got over there to Compton, the pro-slaverites and the anti-slaverites were still causing problems. So he didn't say anything. He went in the land office, found out that his land had been given to Tish Tolany, a widow of the Creek and Indian War. And I was severely saddened to know that a woman had lost her man, but I was living on her land. And so when he came back and told me about this, I said, surely there's something we can do. I don't want to move west and start over again. He didn't either. Well, to make a long story short, he loaded up again and headed out. He'd already told me enough to frighten me about what the pro-slaverites were doing. We waited out there, wondering if he'd come back. We worked on the land. There's always things to do on a farm, especially when you don't have money. And we got to cut wood and crops and more. But when he came back, I was so glad to find out that what had been given to Tish Tolany was actually an Indian float. And while she had been given land of so much to pay for her husband's loss, the land office floated it over here where they could make more money on it, and we claimed our piece of land. And so today, as you look around, the 160 acres here, the other 160 out here, and we will acquire more, because if you saw how much my children are growing, it's just a matter of time, and more people will be coming in. I hope you enjoy your move going west. It's well worth the hardships. Keep an eye on your cabin door and know where your rifle is, but loan it to a good person. I did. And the Kanza were my friends. The Potawatomi were not quite as friendly, but they'd already been harassed before they got here. And now, you sure you menfolk, you've been very comfortable sitting, but don't you want to take care of your livestock? Thank you. Thank you.